Blake's Divine Comedy illustrations are not so much illustrations as a dialogue with Dante. To understand the tensions here, we must begin by taking stock of Blake's worldview. For Blake, God, eternity, heaven, and hell were all immanent in the present world, aspects of our everyday reality, though only visible to the poet, the prophet, and the mystic. The implications of this for religious practice or the fate of the soul after death were questions which Blake gave no clear answers to, if indeed he considered them at all. Blake was a spiritual explorer, making such maps as he could with poetry and painting. He was not a conquistador. He never claimed the realms he visited for a specific political system or religion. He was ultimately honest enough to realize that he was, like all of us, lost, and poet enough not to be unduly bothered by it. Blake adapted Dante's cosmos to his own. He believed he was correcting it, liberating it from dogmatic and ideological limits, which are, by and large, the same ones that make Dante seem quaint to us today. He also felt he was freeing and displaying Dante's real imaginative visions, and usually these are exactly the features that we find appealing now. To orient ourselves in Blake's Dantean world, we need to look at a few images from his Inferno cycle. Blake's Dante is a childlike, androgynous being exploring the world of experience. This world is a bit like a Halloween parade, with the monstrous aspects of adult reality appearing in cartoon-like forms that are more hallucinatory than visionary. The official pageants of the social order appear creatures of delirium, and the punishments of the damned are real but temporary states, which souls inhabit, not for antecedent sins, but for present mistaken views. Some of hell is in fact paradisal, like the circle of the lustful. This is hell only in name, that is, in the opinion of prudes and prigs. A defining characteristic of hell for Blake, as for Dante, is that it is physical and includes the more dire consequences of taking on a mortal form, a vegetated existence in Blake's phrase. But there is a distinction here. Dante's hell is physically physical. Blake's hell is physical insofar as it represents the viewpoint of materialism. For Blake, some of Dante's damned are in fact Promethean heroes, tragic insofar as they are caught up in the cycle of rebellion and reprisal, but essentially noble, for they rebel against the false god of conventional morality and organized religion. Blake's map of hell is the reverse of the conventional one. The fallen angel Lucifer is at the apex rather than at the bottom of the conical pit. For Blake, hell is a place of error from which everyone is expected to ascend. Blake understood sin in terms of ignorance, delusion, and repression, and its antidote was simply wider perception. Not a particularly profound psychology or a very adequate politics, though all friends of liberty are delighted by Blake's anti-authoritarian stance, and his frankness about the role of sex in the psychic economy would satisfy a Freudian. Blake's admirers, of whom I am one, sometimes forget that he was a solitary contemplative. Blake's work must be viewed as a personal journey of psychic exploration, as private and personal as hermetic coding could make it. He was not, despite his rhetoric and scattered contemporary references, a public and political prophet, whereas Dante actually was. Blake's genderless Dante is, like Blake, a romantic poet. Dante himself, Italia's frowning bard, was a man of action who fought in physical battles and reproved living kings in unmistakable terms. This should be borne in mind as we watch Blake's engaging, but not always even-handed, recalibration of Dante's themes. The first of Blake's Purgatorio illustrations shows the poets just after they have emerged from hell onto the island where Mount Purgatory stands. Left to right, we have Virgil pointing at once up and down, suggesting Dante's entire itinerary from hell's depth to the heights of paradise. Dante, amusingly, holds both palms up, as if to say none of this was his decision. Cato has a benign, grandfatherly look, in contrast to the short-tempered warder of Purgatory's shores we found in Dante. According to Dante, he and Virgil went down to the shores of Purgatory to wash the hell soot from Dante's face and to make him a belt of reeds, emblematic of humility. Instead, Blake shows us Virgil apparently crowning Dante with reeds, a consecration rather than a penitential rite. The sunrise in the background emphasizes that for Blake, Purgatory is a mountain of illumination, not of expiation. Here we are still on the shores of Purgatory Island. At right, an angel arrives with a boatload of new souls. The boat is shaped like a crescent moon, which is here, as often in Blake, a symbol of love, and very apt, for the poem now describes Dante's glad reunion with his friend the musician Casella. We see them embracing. In the poem, Dante's clasping arms close on nothingness, for his friend is an insubstantial ghost. Blake was not engaged by the poignance of this image and allowed actual contact. Also, he recast Dante's irascible Cato, who in the poem angrily shoos the reunited friends on their way. Blake's Cato is a sweet old man, whom we see at left looking on indulgently. The climb up the mountain is steepest at the start. One has to climb, as Dante tells us, with hands as well as feet, a point Blake underlines with Dante's somewhat distressingly foreshortened leg. But the progress and the goal are never in doubt, a concept echoed by the sun above, which is encumbered but not obscured by clouds. In Dante, the travelers pause on their ascent to get an overview of the ground gained. Here they look out at the clouds. Blake has sketched the two almost undetectable seated travelers leaning against the rock face. What interested Blake was the suggestion of height achieved by putting the clouds not above, but on the same level as the figures, whose small size shows how awed and humbled they are to see themselves now in the upper atmosphere, in the middle of a cloud bank. In Dante, the travelers encounter the souls of the violently slain, whose unexpected deaths didn't allow them sufficient contrition for their sins. They rush to see the poet-travelers, astonished by the fact that Dante, alone of all on the mountain, casts a shadow. He still has a physical body. Blake's version of the episode omits the shadow and any reference to the cruel ends suffered by these souls. The only aspect of their liberation from sin that interests Blake is the liberation itself, manifest in their exuberant flying forms. Blake departs from Dante also in having them not just run with amazing speed across, but fly through the air around the mountain. Blake believed sin was its own punishment, and that to set aside one's errors conferred instant, automatic forgiveness and a sense of ecstasy. We have now ascended as far as the Valley of Useless Rulers, still outside Purgatory proper. The sovereigns shown seated here never got around to fulfilling their obligations to the governed, so now they must wait to begin their expiation. Blake focused solely on the paradisal qualities of their bower and the peacefulness of their assembly, though in life many of them were earnest enemies. Thus far he follows Dante precisely. Blake makes some adjustment, however, to the angels shown at upper center. In Dante, these are charged with guarding this demi-paradise from the incursions of the serpent, but here they are merely concerned with an aerial ballet. Their flaming swords don't threaten anyone. They're crossed ornamentally, and only one of the angels even notices the serpent, who is seen through the eyes of innocence regained as nothing more than another cute animal. In the poem, Dante falls asleep in the valley, and he is carried to the first level of purgatory itself by St. Lucy, patroness of vision. We can explicate this with a quote from the poem, Morning, from Blake's Songs and Ballads. To find the western path, right through the gates of wrath, I urge my way. Sweet mercy leads me on with soft repentant moan. I see the break of day. The pilgrims approach the gate of repentance, which marks the start of purgatory proper. The faint figures of the poets and the benign angel are overwhelmed by the dark Gothic arch of the entrance, and Dante's inner condition is, as usual, echoed in the sky, where dark red clouds of emotion obscure the sun. Dante has given us a picture of penitence which, though serious, is far from frightening. As described in the poem, here the angel engraves with sword point into Dante's forehead the initial letters of the 7 deadly sins. These will be effaced as he ascends through the several levels of purgatory. For Dante as for Blake, this marks a happy transformation. No sooner does Dante kneel accepting his faults than the whole sky brightens. On the level of pride, the poets find bas-reliefs showing scenes of humility. David, the harpist who composed the Psalms, sets aside his royal dignity to dance before the Ark of God as it is being brought to Jerusalem. Blake includes David's wife Michal looking down from her window, but she seems bemused here rather than disapproving as she is in the biblical and Dantean accounts. Behind the ark we see Uzzah, who was struck down with a thunderbolt for accidentally touching the ark on its progress. Here he seems more like an ecstatic dancer. To the right we have the Annunciation, in which the roles are reversed. The angel Gabriel bows humbly before a very unfazed Mary. On the level of the proud, Dante's penitents crawl along in anguish, bowed under barely supportable burdens. Blake makes them seem merely busy at their task, which their agility shows to be light. The addition of the moon contravenes Dante's rule that progress is only possible in purgatory during the daytime. Blake has effectively halved the sentences of all the condemned. Further along on the same level, Dante finds the pavement engraved with images of pride punished. Blake's illustration follows Dante clockwise. Beginning at the 6 o'clock position, we see crowned Satan upside down, as befits the foremost of the overturned arrogant. Just above him we have the 50-headed, 100-armed giant Briareus, who rebelled against Jupiter, who we are shown at 11 o'clock, with a long curving thunderbolt in his upraised fist. To his right is probably Athena. At the far right we see Nimrod, who built the Tower of Babel in an attempt to displace Jehovah. Nimrod himself is made of sculpted bricks to identify him more effectively with his creation. The serpent coils around Nimrod are probably an extension of Satan. Satan is crowned, for he is an emblem of erroneous authority. In keeping with his view of Satan, Blake has kept from all Dante's types of pride only the figures of kings, Nimrod, king of Babylon, and Jupiter, the lord of Olympus, whom Blake considers just another tyrant. Jupiter's opponent, the many-faced Briareus, is actually the hero of the scene. On closer inspection, we note that his faces are drawn with sympathy for his suffering, a sympathy which is modeled for us in the expression and gesture of Dante. In the poem, these images are incised on the pavement, but here they are tilted up, nearly even with the picture plane. Blake has condensed and combined the images and placed them in a vortex around the pilgrim. Blake's Purgatory is the place where monstrous and violent aspects of the personality are reintegrated into the fully realized person. This is in fact the overall plot line of all of Blake's prophetic books. We have here a parade example of this. Dante, literally and figuratively, takes in the vision of angry authority and helpless rebellion. For Blake, to merely reject the unconscious drives, which Dante calls sins, would produce a personality which was not really good, for it would be neutered beyond even the capacity for evil. The angel who greets the travelers is rendered with particularly auspicious movement and luminosity. For Dante, the first level of purgatory, that of pride, is the critical one. For in Christian psychology, from pride arise all other sins. Blake equates pride with the arrogance of reason, and thus, with a minor adjustment, he is here in agreement with Dante. Here we have reached the level of the envious. According to Dante, those who took a jaundiced view of others' happiness are punished by having their eyes sewn shut with metal threads. Blake has retranslated the closure into the shut eyes of sleep, a very gentle way of suggesting the envier's failure of awareness. Their purgatory is an extended nap time. Blake took the same indulgent approach to sinners we generally apply to cranky children. The envier who speaks to Dante has joyfully awakened to the possibilities of life. Despite his brilliant reinterpretations of pride and envy, Blake seems to have found the topic of particular penance wearisome. He left pride and envy as sketches, and skipped over anger, sloth, greed, and gluttony. The level of lust, however, greatly appealed to Blake. Dante himself saw this as the least grievous of the 7 deadly sins. According to scholastic philosophy, which Dante follows, all sin is a misdirection of love, which finds its proper object in God. To love the human form is to love at least the image of God, and thus Dante places lust on the threshold of the earthly paradise, the innocent Eden which tops Purgatory Mountain. Dante's geography clearly implies what he could not explicitly say. Sex can be a gateway to spiritual experience. It is worth noting that Dante includes homosexuals among the saved, who are working out their final redemption on this last terrace. In the image, Virgil and Dante climb towards the flames that aptly purify those whose passion burned too hot. At lower left, we see the Roman poet Statius, who has been with the travelers since level 5 of Purgatory. Above, an angel invites them into the bright but harmless flames. The sun is at the travelers' backs in the poem. Blake has placed it before them, to show they are proceeding to new illumination. At this second illustration of the level of the lustful, we would do well to recall these lines from Blake's The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. The ancient tradition that the world will be consumed in fire at the end of 6,000 years is true, as I have heard from hell. For the cherub with his flaming sword is hereby commanded to leave his guard at the tree of life, and when he does, the whole creation will be consumed and appear infinite and holy, whereas now it appears finite and corrupt. This will come to pass by an improvement of sensual enjoyment. Once again, Blake has turned Dante's torments into delights. The tree at right, like the foliage edging the path, is a hint that sexual pleasure is a foretaste of paradise, an unexpectedly Islamic perspective from the great Christian mystic. From right to left, we have Statius, literally marginal to the scene, then Dante, cringing from the fire with an expression of dismay, which should amuse us. Unlike Dante's, these Blakean flames inflict no cauterizing pain. The Catholic poet shrieks in virginal dread of sex. Virgil walks into the fire like a dancer. The angel above him leads the way, and the 4 lustful ladies pirouette like bathing beauties choreographed by Busby Berkeley. We are now on the steps between the level of lust and the earthly paradise. As we noted on the moonlit level of pride, in Blake's version of Purgatorio, rest is not mandated during the nighttime hours, so we may fairly seek another reason for these languid poses. Coming immediately after the level of lust, they could be read as post-coital. Dante sleeps in the middle, and utterly spent Statius sprawls over 2 steps at bottom, and Virgil looks up with what seems an expression of dazed, erotic bliss. The scene seems to allude to Beulah, a realm Blake imagined as a moonlit resting place between eternity and the physical world. In the moon, Blake has faintly sketched Dante's dream as given in the poem. Dante dreamed of the patriarch Jacob's daughters Rachel and Leah. Christian theology saw the former as representing the contemplative religious life. Thus she stares at her own beauty in the mirror, finding God through self-examination. Leah is the active religious life. She sits beneath a tree, weaving garlands of flowers. For Dante, the earthly paradise, Eden, is a garden atop Mount Purgatory. For Blake, it is the part of eternity we can experience in the physical world, empowered by poetic inspiration and intelligent delight. In the picture, we have Virgil and Statius standing between the trees at lower right, while Dante has advanced to address the nymph Matilda, guardian of the river whose waters allow one to forget one's sins and remember one's good deeds. That is, a drink from this river cures regret. Dante sees on the further bank the parade of the biblical imagination. At its head is a 7-branched temple candelabrum. Each of its flames, burning with a different color, leaves a trail behind it in the air. The flames are reflected in the mirror-like river. The candles are followed by 24 elders, who are the books of the Old Testament, then the Chariot of the Church, and elders who personify the New Testament books. We will see the chariot up close in the next image. This is the second to last of Blake's Purgatorio paintings, and it is a culmination not only of Blake's artistry, but of the biblical visionary tradition. The image was first given by Ezekiel, expanded by St. John, poeticized by Dante, and finally painted by Blake. It was 2.5 millennia in the making, so we must spend some little time analyzing it. The chariot itself comes from a passage in Ezekiel, who describes not really a chariot, but the flaming throne of God surrounded by 4 genie-like creatures with the faces of man, lion, ox, and eagle, and accompanied by wheels inset with eyes. Ezekiel's description is very hard to make sense of now. In the 8th century BC, Ezekiel drew on the description of God's throne first formulated by Isaiah in the 6th century BC. No doubt Ezekiel and his readers were aware of how Isaiah's throne vision had been expanded in the intervening centuries of prophetic literary tradition lost to us. If we had that material, we could parse Ezekiel's vision in fine detail. What we can say about it with assurance is that the flames go back to the archaic Hebrew conception of God as enthroned in the sky, manifesting with lightning like Zeus. By Ezekiel's time, the storm origin of the fire was forgotten, and the flames represented holiness and illumination. The genies are winged sky spirits, and their different heads probably represent the 4 directions, that is, the idea that God is omnipresent. The wheels similarly indicate God's ability to go or be everywhere instantly, while the many eyes indicate omniscience. By the time of St. John, Hebrew tradition had understood Ezekiel's vision as a chariot or Merkabah, and developed a tradition of mysticism focused on ascending in it to heaven, through meditation to obtain spiritual insight. John incorporated the Merkabah in the book of Revelation and reformulated the 4 genies as symbols of the 4 evangelists. To Blake, these must have suggested the 4 Zoas of his own mythology. The Zoas are the 4 aspects of human existence as body, emotions, intellect, and imagination. For Blake, the many eyes must have meant less God's omniscience than man's capacity to see the eternal everywhere. The griffin who draws the chariot is Dante's edition. In Christian iconography, the griffin is a symbol of Christ, indicating his twofold heavenly and earthly nature. Blake, following Dante, has placed beside the chariot, from left to right, the three Christian virtues: hope in green, love in red, and faith in white. This last, in Dante's phrase, "Mother of the others directs their dance." Dante stands before the griffin, and in the chariot is Beatrice, in her role of spiritual guide, who will take Dante to the highest heaven. The last of the Purgatorio visions is actually a political cartoon. At right we have a faintly drawn kneeling female figure, which might be one of Matilda's handmaidens, then Matilda, Dante and Statius, looking on at the church, or for Blake, the spiritual imagination, debased for worldly purposes. In the chariot stands the whore of Babylon from the book of Revelation, sporting with the kings of the earth. For St. John, the whore was the Roman Empire. For Dante, she was the papacy in Avignon, captive to the King of France, who is shown as the bearded ogre kissing her. The chariot has turned into a many-headed dragon. For St. John, this was the earthly political powers subject to Rome. For Dante, it was a symbol of heresy. For Blake, the dragon is rather an image of cold, hard materialism. As in the book of Revelation, the dragon has 7 heads with collectively 10 horns. Blake has given one of the heads a papal crown, but we should probably read this as a dig at organized religion in general, though it is well within the tradition of Protestant anti-Catholic iconography. In the background is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Fittingly, this culminating vision of sin takes place on the site of original sin. Blake's Purgatorio is the only treatment of this canticle that really goes beyond illustration into fine art. All the other renderings simply serve the text. Though many do this masterfully, they do not offer a genuine dialogue with it, such as we find in the Rauschenberg Inferno or the Gross Paradiso series. Blake engages, admires, and disputes the text with Dante. For Blake, Dante is still alive. In his images, we can listen in on a conversation between Italy's and England's greatest mystical poets.